Hello, everyone. Hello. Welcome to this session of Getting Real today. My name is Loira Limbal. I am the Senior Vice President of Programs at Firelight Media, which is a Harlem based organization. And I am also the director and producer of Through the Night, which will be the closing night film at this year Getting Real's conference. Thank you for joining us today. We're looking forward to being in conversation with you. Today's program is a collaboration between the IDA Getting Real conference and team and Firelight Media's Beyond Resilience program. Before I say much else, I just want to do a brief land acknowledgement. We like to start all of our programs at Firelight with a land acknowledgement to serve both as a reminder that we are all on colonized land and also an invitation for us to be thinking actively of ways to be in solidarity with Native and Indigenous people wherever we find ourselves in the world. I am coming to you today from the Bronx, New York, land of the Lenape people. I want to also thank the amazing team at the IDA for creating the space for our field and our community to come together in such distressing global times. I'm really, really happy to be here with you all. I also want to thank our fabulous moderator, who I will introduce briefly, our panelists, and our ASL interpreter for being with us this afternoon or morning, depending on where you're joining from. To say a brief word about Firelight, we are actually celebrating our 20th anniversary this year. We were founded in the year 2000 by filmmaker Stanley Nelson and his partner Marcia Smith. We are known for many things. We produce films. You may know us for some of Stanley's films like Miles Davis' Birth of the Cool, The Black Panthers, Vanguard of the Revolution, Freedom Riders, The Murder of Emmett Till, and many others. We also have a number of programs that support emerging filmmakers of color, and we do work around impact and engagement to cultivate audiences among communities of color for nonfiction work. And the Beyond Resilience series, which this panel is a part of, was launched. It's one of our newest programs. We launched it in June of this year. Really as an attempt to create a space for curated conversations that could explore the challenges, strategies, and experiences of creating and distributing work during a time of crisis. And our series takes a global and historical view of films created by BIPOC filmmakers during critical periods of disaster, seeking to learn from the filmmakers, their community, and the resilience born from collective experiences. For today's conversation, which we have called the Liberatory Canon, I'd like to acknowledge all of the amazing organizing work that has been happening in the nonfiction space that has been led by Black, Indigenous, and filmmakers of color across the US that has focused a lot of attention on the colonial roots of documentary filmmaking and has helped us build kind of a new understanding and new vocabulary to examine and assess, our field and our practices and sort of our values, our collective values. Today's conversation is meant to lift up the names of the Black and Indigenous and filmmakers of color ancestors, folks who came before us who stubbornly resisted dominant narratives and the white gaze to create films that fashioned us in our own image at times that were arguably much harder to do that work within. And so this conversation is an attempt to call their names, remember their names, lift up their legacies, their work, their visions, their arts. And I'd like to share some words from one of those brilliant ancestors, filmmaker Kathleen Collins, who was an activist during the with SNCC during the Civil Rights Movement and went on to carve a career for herself as a playwright and filmmaker during a time when Black women were rarely seen in those roles. So Kathleen says, and this is a sort of a combination of a couple of different quotes that she shared during her time with us on the earth. We needed to be autodidacts. We needed to pass books from hand to hand. We needed to search and thus be inspired by the hard-won effort to create ourselves. Our minds are intricate. Our minds are intricate. Our desires are complex. We are gorgeously contradictory in our epistemologies. I mispronounced that. You know what I'm saying, yeah. We were not invented yesterday. And with that, I think that's the key for today as we are confronting so many types of violence, so much harm, so much tragedy everywhere that we look. We hope that today's conversation can be a reminder of the very fact that we were not invented yesterday and we are still here. We're not only living, surviving, but in many ways we are thriving or creating work that allows us to imagine a future where we can thrive. So with that, I will introduce our moderator, Yasmina Price, who is a writer, researcher, and PhD student in the Departments of African American Studies and Film and Media Studies at Yale University. She focuses on anti-colonial African cinema and the work of visual artists across the Black diaspora, with a particular interest in the experimental work of women filmmakers. Recent work has appeared in the New York Review of Books, the New Inquiry, and Social Text Online. Welcome, Yasmina, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for that beautiful introduction, Loida. And I would also like to take a moment to remind everyone that we do have ASL interpreters, Hope and Mara, as well as closed captioning. So I'm going to begin by introducing our panelists. We have Stanley Nelson, who is the founder of Firelight Media and among the premier documentary filmmakers working today. His feature-length films combine compelling narratives with rich and deeply researched historical detail, shining new light on both familiar and underexplored aspects of the American past. In addition to honors for his individual films, Nelson and his body of work have garnered every major award in the industry. He is a MacArthur Genius Fellow and was awarded an individual Peabody Award, the 2016 Lifetime Achievement Award from the National Academy of Television Arts and Sciences, and received the National Medal in the Humanities. Our next panelist is Janaina Oliveira, who has a PhD in history and is a professor at the Federal Institute of Rio de Janeiro and Fulbright Scholar at the Center for African Studies at Howard University in Washington, D.C. Since 2009, she has led research focused on Black and African cinemas. She's the head programmer of the Zozimo Bulbul Black Film Festival in Rio, part of the programming committee of the FINCAR, International Women Filmmakers Festival in Recife, and the advisor for the African and Black diaspora films for the Locarno Film Festival in Switzerland. She's a member of the Association of Black Audiovisual Professionals and the founder and coordinator of the Black Cinema Itinerant Forum. Oliveira is the programmer of the 66th Flaherty Film Seminar scheduled for June 2021. Next, we have Heather Rae, who is a film and television producer and narrative change activist. Rae produced Academy Award-nominated Frozen River, received the Piaget Producers Award, and has been recognized as Variety's producer to watch. Rae produced Netflix originals Tallulah, starring Ellen Page and Allison Janney, and Dude from Blacklist winner Olivia Milch. Sundance Highlight, The Dry Land, starring America Ferrera, and Festival Darling, I Believe in Unicorns, from director Leah Meyerhoff. More recently, Rae has produced Bull, which premiered in Cannes, and Amazon series Outer Range, starring Josh Brolin. As a filmmaker, Rae directed the acclaimed documentary Trudell, which tells the story of movement leader and poet John Trudell. Formerly, Rae ran the Native program at the Sundance Institute, And recently, Ray began an overall producing deal with Amazon Studios. As a speaker and social critic, Ray is working from both her settler and indigenous heritage to deepen the dialogue of reconciliation and responsibility in the Americas. As all of you are no doubt aware, we were supposed to have a fourth panelist, Rasha Salti, the researcher, writer, and curator, who's not with us presently, but we are hoping that she will make it. So I wanted to start in response to Loira's beautiful introduction by mentioning one of these ancestors, and that would be Paulin Souleymane Viera, who was born in Benin but mostly lived in Senegal, and was a filmmaker and historian and one of the most important figures in African cinema, who was doing the crucial work of chronicling the emergence and development, as well as the volume and variety of cinematic production on the African continent. Well, when we think of the liberatory, anti-colonial production of cinema, we might think of the 60s and 70s, of the third cinema movements, the sort of revolutionary global militant films that were coming out at that time. But he already, in 1955, had made a film called Afrique sur scène, which explored the lives of Africans in Paris. Which is to say that in this short composite documentary, he was already emphatically making the point that even in the colonial capital were lodged other ways of seeing and conceiving and understanding the world. Which is to say that what is at stake in all of this is very much the production of knowledge and the way that images and the visual participate in this, with documentaries having perhaps, and this is definitely contested, the most evident or direct relationship to that process in the ways that they chronicle social, political history and can act not only as witnesses, but also as participants. And this work is one that absolutely demands access and knowledge to the archives of work that has come earlier. So Loira mentioned that these genealogies of oppositional cinema can sometimes sort of fall to the side when we're considering the focus of interrogating the more colonial roots of documentary, and this can end up being a work of erasure, which I would like to offer is not dissimilar from how Indigenous people are treated in North America. And I'm thinking specifically of how both the US and Canadian states perpetuated not only material genocide on Indigenous peoples, but also created these narratives of extinction and erasure, which locked Indigenous people in the past as though they were not surviving and consistently refusing and resisting the settler state. So with that framing, I was hoping that we could start with you, Heather, and consider the role and importance of Indigenous filmmaking as a labor of living, of documenting old knowledge and new life when we are faced with these narratives of extinction.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me to join this conversation. Thank you so much to Firelight and to Stanley Nelson for your incredible legacy of work, and for all of the work that this organization does, and particularly to support Indigenous filmmakers such as Tracy Rector and Ben Alex Dupree. Really appreciate the inclusion. And I also want to acknowledge the land that I'm on right now. I'm in my home state of Idaho at the moment, and I'm on the ancestral lands of the Shoshone and Paiute peoples. Some of the filmmakers that I feel have truly influenced this movement are filmmakers from all over the world, and I think that oftentimes people do not see that the indigenous population of this planet is the world's second largest population, second to the 4.5 billion people who are of Asian descent. Indigenous people are the world's second largest population, about 1.5 billion people. And why I mention that is because so much of the narrative around Indigenous people or tribal people is the notion that we're talking about what we might think of as the vanishing minority. This group of people who are, essentially that modernism and conquest are diminishing these cultures. And the reality is that isn't true at all. And in fact, these are cultures that are incredibly vital, vibrant, that are, changing the world just like all cultures are. And oftentimes as well, Indigenous people are the people who are on the front lines of these and, you know, sometimes deadly battles for land and water and human rights. And so if we realize that Indigenous people are the people that are fighting for the land and water for everyone, we recognize this is a really important part of the makeup and the population of our planet. Indigenous people manage and protect about 25% of the Earth's surface, and Indigenous people manage and protect 90% of the Earth's biosphere. So this is a really important population that too often is erased by media. And I look at media as one of the most powerful weapons used against us. And that's historically speaking and you know, in reference to now as well. I know that for myself personally, and I'll just speak personally for a moment, you know, and so many other, you know, Native filmmakers I've spent 2 decades being told that Native American content or Native stories were not commercially viable, that there wasn't an audience for these stories. And what I've come to realize is that's really a kind of internalized rhetoric in this entertainment industry that has its systemic roots in white supremacy. It doesn't actually have much to do with reality. And I started working with an organization, Illuminative, a couple of years ago when the organization was founded by a powerful visionary, Crystal Echohawk. And Crystal's organization, Illuminative, is entirely built on data and research. And one of the first things that I learned from this data when engaging, you know, with the work that we were setting out to do was the realization that 78% of Americans want to know more about Native Americans. And I'll never forget that day because I had to sit down because I had 2 decades of being told that we had absolutely no value whatsoever. And I had to sit down and realize they were lying. They were lying. It's not even in the data, you know, and that was such a powerful moment for me to realize that, you know, that it's on purpose, you know, it's on purpose. So many things are on purpose. I mean, I think of Janaea Khan as always saying, poverty's on purpose. Erasure is on purpose. It benefits. It benefits settler colonial consciousness. It benefits the settler colonial state, and it is baked into settler colonial consciousness. And at the same time, the erasure is not. The invisibility is not real. You know, we're here, and I think that so many of us have such incredible stories to tell. And I know how challenging it's been in my time, so I often wonder about those who came before, like the late filmmaker Phil Lucas, Merita Mita, probably the grandmother of Indigenous cinema, the Maori filmmaker who broke ground when nobody else was. You know, the incredible First Nation Canadian filmmaker Alanisa Bomsuwan. Like so many filmmakers that have broken through that invisibility, but only to meet extraordinary walls of resistance to these stories. I oftentimes say that I feel as though there has been a cultural gag order when it comes to Indigenous people, and particularly in American television, you know, where we make up 1/10 of 1% of the representation in American film and television. I mean, that's a deplorable erasure. So where we are now on the backs of so many who've come before us is in a place where there's a window of opening right now. Something is shifting in the culture. I'd even say it's in kind of a post-Standing Rock world where suddenly people are starting to awaken to the idea that Indigenous people are here and there's powerful stories. We're a very young country. We're a very young country, this country. And I oftentimes think of the United States as being a very young country that sits atop a bedrock of ancient and profound civilizations. And the only real access points that we have are stories. And so if we can find the ways to actually create those access points, there's a lot of value there and a lot that we can draw from. So I actually personally believe that it's very much of interest for us to be inclusive of all stories and all peoples. It has integrity in terms of, you know, how we represent ourselves as, you know, as a nation, as a continent. However, I think that it's an act of restoring integrity when we are including everybody. So I'll start with that, but thank you.
Thank you, Heather. I'd like to pull out one thing from what you said, which is considering that even if things are not where they should be now, that they are still building on work that has been done before. And so returning to this point that there's a lot to be learned from these histories of documentaries and this imperative to open up the archives. And one recent opening that I've been personally thrilled about is that of Black Journal, and also the upcoming William Greaves work. And obviously, Stanley, William Greaves was your mentor, so it would be wonderful if you could speak a little bit to how you've seen the importance of having those lineages and those genealogies of work.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the great things and important things was that, you know, I'll call him Bill because that's what I was called. You know, Bill Greaves, you know, had a camera and was a camera person, and his son was a camera person, and they shot stuff, and they realized the importance of just documenting things. So we would film stuff without knowing like what we were going to do with it, but we would just film it, you know, and those became really important archives. But I think, you know, that those kind of things, not only that Bill did, but I got a call today about a collection from Gil Noble, you know, who had a show called Like It Is in New York, a kind of a Sunday morning talk show for 43 years, right? He had this show on weekly, and he interviewed everybody from Malcolm X to, you know, anybody. And the stuff sits in storage. You know, he was one of those guys who owned his own show, his own footage. And so it sits in storage with his family, who can't do anything with it. They can't get it out. They can't afford. And that's what happens so many times. So, you know, this stuff is there. You know, William Greaves, his wife, Louise, and his son, David, you know, they have warehouses full of material, but they can't do anything with it. You know, the cost of doing with it, and somebody realizing the value of this material is really, really important, because it's our history, and it's a different history, you know, that we don't see so many times, because these were really independent people who had independent, you know, shows and did very different things, you know, with the footage. So I think it's important that we figure out how to get this stuff out there and get it used and get it seen. You know, I've done a number of historical films, and I found that there's stuff out there, you know, when you dig, you know, if you dig and you have the resources and take the time to dig, but that's what's really important is you know, to do that digging and find that history that's there.
Thank you. And obviously that involves the work of the filmmakers who are doing this documenting and witnessing, but the other side of the coin is the one of public accessibility and the actual circulation of this work. So Janina, I was wondering if you could speak, since you are a curator and a fabulous programmer, about that angle and how you can see your role and the role of other curators and programmers in intervening in that process.
Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. It's afternoon here in Rio. Before talking, I just want to thank you the invitation for being here with you all. I'm very happy. Thank you, Laura, all the Firelight, Yasmina, Heather, Stanley. Also, I want to acknowledge that I'm here in the Great Tupinambá Tamoyo region in Rio. Was the foremost indigenous people here when the Portuguese arrived in the 16th century. Talking about my role and my perspective as a programmer in this relationship, because even though I would like to, before talking about, you know, my field of work that's more related to Black films and Black film histories and documentaries, I would like to just to make a quick note and agree with pretty much everything that Heather said about the indigenous filmmaking and the approach of the historical approach and how it affects the communities. There, you can get the generalities and it's pretty much the same here in Brazil, in the sense that the way that's so invisible is not in vain, it's on purpose. Just you know, and so actual. Just a quick note on that. Recently, the occupant of the presidency here just said that all the fires that are going on in Amazon in the Pantanal are the indigenous fault. So this huge and, how do you say, irresponsible and brutal bad imaginary around indigenous people is it's still something that's going on, even though we have a new generation of indigenous filmmakers doing and producing and even getting more attention from film festivals now. Is still like proportionally invisible, and I do believe that has to do a lot with this whole bad imaginary that is still going on in Brazil, sadly, nowadays. But when you coming back to your question and thinking about how my work basically started related to the work of Zózimo Bubu, that we can say that's kind of the founding father of Black films here in Brazil. And he started making films in the 70s that we can set like the beginning of Black film history in that around that time. And Zózimo, for example, he made a lot of short films, documentary films, but he made only one feature film in 1988. It's called Abolition. And it's a piece dedicated to because 1988 was the 100 years of the abolition here in Brazil. So it was a whole movement, Black movement around celebration and statements around this year celebration, and Zózimo succeeded to make this film. And it's a very long piece, has 2 hours and a half, 2 hours and 43 minutes, if I'm not mistaken. It was supposed to have 4 hours, but he cut it a bit and made like 2 hours and 40 minutes. And so far, like 32 years later, and it's still like invisible in terms of, people who really had watched this film or really had recently. Zózimo's work is more visible and has to do with programming, and not only my work, but with several programs that have been going around not only Brazil but abroad. But I'm throwing attention to this piece because so far, only now that has been programmed in Locarno, has been programmed in New York, now actually is online and people can watch it in the US. It's available in a Limite Film Festival, something like that. Only now people are getting attention to Zózimo as a documentary filmmaker. So what I think that my role and our role, those who are as programmers, related to this so close canon in terms of documentary films. I'm saying so close canon because before I was preparing here and thinking about what to say and trying to figure out what you're going to ask. And then I was giving, I gave a quick look to the list of the 100 best documentary films in Brazil elected by the Film Critics Academy. And there's one Black filmmaker. I think he's on the fourth post, something like that. So he's placed in the line. And Zózimo, for example, he's not there in terms of, the acknowledgement and reconnaissance. So I think our role as programmers is really to break this, to open these doors, to stop being gatekeepers and start, opening doors and making films to circulate and give the acknowledgement of those that, came before us and fight so hard to make films. And for example, Zózimo is one of them. I can quote, for example, Joelzito Araújo that start making documentary films too, that made a very important piece on Brazilian television. By the way, Black Journal was also a recent discovery for me, and it made me think a lot how would be Brazilian imaginary if we had something even close like that on broadcasted here in the 60s or 70s. Anyway, I don't know if I answer your question, but I think that, you know, what we do, programmers of colors, programmers that are not on hegemonic circuits and occupying those places recently, I think we had the opportunity to make different things and promoting and bringing this, not only the memory, but also the actual and the contemporary connections with, you know, the people that are producing now. So that's you know, general lines. I think that's what I mean. So.
Thank you for that. Something I'm thinking about is so the sidelining of someone like Zozimo in certain institutions and for certain forms of listing. I think also points to the fact that you know, the metrics of work that matters for us, that matters for liberation, that matters for abolition, that matters for actually changing the world, just might never really map onto dominant narratives or dominant structures. And to pick up on that last thing you were saying, that this is also a question of doing the work of tying the past to the contemporary moment, which is going to need flexibility and interpretation. And this is a question for any of you, because obviously we are in a different situation of globalized capital, but also of digitization and of an ability to connect the local to the global in ways that weren't possible before. So if any of you could speak to that sort of interaction between specific places and broader contexts.
I'll let you guys go ahead.
Yeah, it's not a question that I can answer.
I mean, I'll try, but just thinking about, you know, this last thing that you said about this connection between the local and the global. I mean, I for my experience as a programmer working for some international film festivals, I see that pretty much that what we are doing now is change a little bit this idea of global, in the sense that, you know, what people expect to be the connections between films, because what happens, in fact, there's a lot of that films that we are working and we are talking, people just don't know about it. It's a big, you know, huge ignorance about it. So I think that I don't know. I believe that the idea of global is changing, and we are finding different connections from those that we had before in terms of the expectations. And I think that the local, I mean, it's getting more room on that space, that you don't have necessarily to have explicit or obvious or direct dialogue with the audience that you're, you know, I'm thinking about as a programmer, that you're screening. Even though big film festivals, they do like that you still keep, make them very comfortable and stay in the key of world cinema. That's the global idea of cinema. But then when you succeed to break this and affirm the things that you're, you know, that you're intending to affirm with that program, my experience that the results pretty much interesting, and people can connect, in fact, to very distant and different realities. You know, so I think that's, I don't know if I make myself clear, but what I'm trying to say is that I think that the idea and the relationships, they are changing. Not just the relationship between center and, you know, periphery and the margins. So I think this is the shift that we're living now. I hope a good one, but I don't know.
I think definitely a good one, because I think something like world cinema is a clear category that so evidently makes the divide between the West as the principle and the world is just sort of a general everything else. I'd also like to note that IDA is going to follow up with more information about all the filmmakers and films that have been mentioned for everyone in the audience who is curious. And I will now give you one of the audience questions. which is, in Brazil or France, where the story of the elites is closer to the surface, how are colonial narratives shown and marketed differently?
I mean, I think there's another part of the question that is mainstream, the mainstream TV company now that's in the relationship between, because it's the whole of this company here in Brazil is very strong in a sense, in the way how they during 60 years have been shaping our imaginary. So I think also this is so I believe that things are now changing, because after you can say like 40 years of Black movements fight, but also after 16 years of global policies of education, and I'm referring, of course, to the Lula and Dilma political era as presidents. We have now a generation of not only filmmakers, but also an audience that's really more critical of everything, of every content they are receiving, but also that are producing different perspectives and really, of course, we're talking about an industry, so it's not very easy to get distant, but what I see is that you have a new generation. By new generation, I mean people that now it's on their like 20s, 30s, 35s, the most, that are really engaged in creating and amplifying, a different repertoire of images, and an audience very, very receptive for that. So even though you have these mainstream groups, even though pretty much of the film funds in Brazil, and that's something important to say because it's different from different other parts of the world. In Brazil, the main funds for cinema, they come from public. That's why it's also very serious all that's going on here politically, because the funds are now suspended. And but even though you have this mainstream that's pretty much distant from this generation production, but people are still doing things and open different possibilities. So, I mean, that makes me also very hopeful about the future somehow, to see what, this new generation fighting for different kind of images and narratives and connections.
Thank you.
I can add something. Yasmina, just I think to the conversation that this is sort of a macro thought to the conversation, but also specific to the idea of global cinema. I think that one of the things that is really important about the times that we're in right now, and I love everything that you were saying, Shanena, in terms of that things are really, I have hope also. But one of the areas that I think is still really important is the idea that we have to interrogate authorship. And I still think that particularly in the documentary space, we are so laden with the anthropologists telling the story. And I see that still really impacting, European cinema, for example. I think it's a phenomenon within Brazilian and other, cinemas throughout the Americas, South, Central, and North America. But it's the idea that, I know specific to indigenous people, and I'm including people who are indigenous tribal peoples from the continent of Africa or throughout Southeast Asia, the Americas. It's the phenomenon of the anthropologist telling the indigenous story was really one of the very first notes struck within the documentary filmmaking. For as long as we've been with this medium, 120 some years or whatever it is, some of those very first films that were made by anthropologists. And that was the precedent set. And it's been very hard for us over the last century to really get out from under that. And it's very much the standard is, and there's a lot of assumptions made within that. And I think what often, documentary filmmakers don't really understand is the history of their own medium. and the lineages and legacies of where documentary filmmaking comes from, which if you look at the group of anthropologists who were the very first filmmakers, effectively, they were one generation removed from the anthropologists who were putting human beings in zoos. You know, that is part of the legacy of the documentary form, is the observation of the exotic, of the cultural, of the tribal. And it was not long before all of that began that, you know, that Franz Boas and that generation of anthropologists were putting people from the African continent, from the Amazon region of Brazil and Ecuador, from Papua New Guinea, from the Americas, in zoos on exhibition in Europe and in the United States. That was up until the 1930s. And it's all the same. It's the same DNA of observation of the exotic that perpetuates through our medium today. So it's one of the reasons why I always feel like it's so important for us to interrogate authorship. And I think that's happening within our industry in the US, which I think is really important, but less so in Europe, for example. I think that French cinema, so many of European cinema's traditions have been to go out and observe the other someplace else in the world. And it's a dangerous prospect. So it's one of the things that I think we are challenging right now in the theoretical spaces, but we need to continue to do that, you know? So it's a bit more of a macro perspective, but I think it's important in these conversations for us to be talking about that, you know?
And I think you're making a very important point about agency and the subject of the films also participating in the act of creation in some way, which is something that a lot of the Latin American third cinema filmmakers were very attentive to having these more collaborative processes to sort of break that power dynamic somewhat. And I'd be interested from both you and Heather and Stanley, since you are both filmmakers, if this notion of collaboration is something that has spoken to both how you've made your films, but also the processes of distribution and exhibition.
Mr. Nelson.
I don't know. What happened? Can you see me?
Yes.
Yes.
Well, I can't see you. So can you ask me the question again? I totally lost contact here.
Oh, of course. The question was one about collaboration in filmmaking and how that's been a part of these sort of liberatory, anti-colonial, Black modes of cinematic production.
I mean, I think that no matter how you make films, it's a collaborative process, and that's really important. I think that, you know, one of the things I wanted to add to the discussion is that I think it's important that we expand on the idea of what the exotic is, so that, you know, if you're going into an African American neighborhood and making a film about, you know, a welfare mother whose daughter is a drug addict, whose son is, you know, in prison, then that's also the exotic. You know, if you're a Caucasian filmmaker, and so, you know, I think it's really important that we understand that that's really an expanded term. You know, it's a huge term of what is exotic, and it's really important that filmmakers kind of look at themselves and look at why they are making films in a way that they haven't, I think, up until this time.
Absolutely. There's a question for Heather, which is related to anthropological history of our field and the resulting effects of harmful and reductive narratives. But the person asking the question says, but I often wonder if those anthropologists were actually the progressives of our time, and if we can illuminate the history in terms of the ideas that they were wrestling with during that time.
I think that they were the progressives of the time, you know, but at the same time, the people who created the boarding school system, the residential school system in the US and Canada, and took more than 50% of Native children, those were also progressives at the time. So, you know, I mean, I couldn't be more to the left, but I think you should always question progressive values, because we should be questioning everything, you know. So what I'm proposing is that we interrogate the authorship. And so to Stanley's point, and the example that you used, Stanley, of going into a community and exploring poverty as a theme, for example, and it's not even that I'm suggesting that a person should not tell a story that they are deeply moved to tell, or even in situations where the story really finds you. I think my point is that you interrogate that authorship. And, you know, what is that person? If the person is, you know, for example, you know, a white filmmaker telling a story in a particular neighborhood of predominantly African-American peoples, that I'm just using the scenario that Stanley suggested. Well, if that person grew up in that neighborhood, then they have a specific relationship to that community. You know, I think there's ways in which we can question. It really comes down to interrogating authorship as a system of evaluating integrity. And is there integrity in the process? And, you know, this is obviously a big conversation, and it's one that's worth a lot of time because it needs to be explored. Why I think it's important is because it is, as I said earlier, it's the precedent set when it comes to people from culture. It is the precedent set within our medium in terms of telling the story of people of culture. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's important to disrupt that somewhat. I'm not suggesting that all films made, you know, again, that all films made by what I'm calling the anthropologists are harmful. But I think as a larger system, it's absolutely harmful by the notion that the person telling the story is objective. That isn't real. We know that, you know, or that they're deeply observational. And I have certainly seen in our industry many times that there is a suggestion that a person who is perceivably a white filmmaker has more neutrality or objectivity to their filmmaking than someone who is actually from the culture, where there is more subjectivity or you know, a perceived bias. And I don't agree with that assumption at all. I think there's something powerful to telling the story from, not about.
Can I add something on that? Because I think also, can I? Yes, okay. No, because I think you're, you know, Stanley, and you are making an important point when you're throwing light to this, to the question about the authorship. Because for me as a programmer, this is also relate to my work in the sense that usually programmers, hegemonic programmers, they defend themselves, you know, just separating the one that is doing the work from the work as such a thing. Like the film, the quality of the film is the more important, when we know that, you know, everybody that work as a programmer know who is doing the film, when, and what is coming from. And for me, one important thing is always to consider, I'm not saying that you're gonna program a film or not because it's made by a white person talking about the Black or Indigenous community, but it's something that we really have to pay attention into, because tokenization is more, you know, in in fashion than ever. You have, like, of course, great, amazing filmmakers, very responsible, connected to, you know, the teams with integrity, to use a word that you said, Heather. But we can't deny that if you're a white person in the world, you have more chances of making a film, period, because you have more access to funds and you have more access to the whole system. So it's not that your story is not valid, it's just that we had too much of those stories already. So I think also it's, you know, as a program, is something that I think every programmer should be, you know, had an eye on that, you know, had this concern to understand how that person is able to tell that story, you know, and
yeah,
crucial for me.
Yeah, if I understand kind of what's being said here, you know, I mean, I don't question people's integrity. That's not the problem. You know, the problem is, you know, should they be telling that story or not? The problem is that once they tell that story's never going to be told again. So that's the story that we get. You know, I mean, I think that you know, 99% of the filmmakers who tell these stories, you know, are well-meaning. I don't think that they're, you know, they're not well-meaning, but that's not enough to be well-meaning. To be empathetic is not enough. Okay, why should they be telling that story? And I think that is almost, in some ways, if somebody doesn't understand white privilege, then that's to me one of the clearest examples that you can give somebody. You know, white people have privilege. They can walk in, you know, to a programmer. I don't want to name any names, and it's like, you know, there's just something I really like about old Bob. You know, let's give him the money to make this film. I think he's going to really do a good job. I really trust him. That's what white privilege is, you know. And so it's not that I doubt people's integrity. I know they're well-meaning. You know, probably Flaherty was well-meaning.
And to bring these points together a little bit, I think what you're indicating is this sort of blindness of whiteness, where that privilege is absolutely tied to power, to institutional power, to material resources, is also the one that gets attached to what, Heather, you were talking about, which is this assumption of objectivity. Whereas, as Janina was bringing up, the really crucial point is to make clear what someone's position is, because then you know how you can read the story that they're telling and the way that they're telling it. Stanley, there's a question for you, which sort of ties, because something we can consider is that in the age of increasing digital technologies is that there is an assumption that in some ways the process is becoming democratized and is more accessible to more people. But as we know, there still are immense institutional barriers, problems with financing. And this question is about footage from young mobile phone filmmakers on the front lines of social justice, so who are doing that work of documenting and witnessing in the immediate present, and what advice you would have for them.
Yeah, I mean, you know, we were involved, the lab was involved in Who Streets, which, you know, was really, you know, from the front lines of Ferguson, and it was made by people from there, and you know, they had access to very, very, very close up and could really get in there. I think that you know, the main thing that if you're shooting, you know, is to, you know, just watch films and understand what. I mean, we all see a lot of films. I mean, you know, we all know what a film should look like. I think that's also what's important. If you're on the front lines, then get in close. You know, and get in close and get those close-ups and get, you know, there's a great shot in Who Streets where, you know, there people are arguing and yelling at the cops, and the cops are standing there in a line, and this one black woman cop, you know, you see a tear roll down her cheek. You know, it's just an amazing shot that you'll never forget, and that's because the camera's in there close. You know, one thing I was really surprised about, you know, in the protest this summer was that, you know, when you watch the news, you know, you're watching MSNBC or CNN, the hosts in the studio were telling the camera people, you know, get back, you know, go back, you know, you got to be safe, get back. When, you know, our instincts as documentary filmmakers is to go in. You know, go in, go close, get in there, and get that thing that nobody else can get. And so I think that's what's important. You know, obviously we're going to see some great stuff that I think that's going to come out of the protest this summer, because it looked like every single person had their phone up in their hand and was filming. And so I think we'll see some great stuff. You know, I think people are just going to get better and better at filming. But we've already seen it. You know, we wouldn't know about George Floyd's death if it wasn't for somebody with a camera and somebody who knew that it wasn't like this wasn't a 20-second shot. This was like something that I'm just going to keep my camera here and stay here, you know. So we're seeing it, and we'll see it more and more.
Thank you. And so staying in line with questions about the task of the filmmaker, the documentary filmmaker, there's a question for Heather. In regards to interrogating the author, what long-term commitment does the filmmaker have to the community past, present, and future?
Well, I think that's a really good question. And part of what I'm suggesting when I say interrogate authorship is to find the connective tissue and what the relationship with the potential author has with the subject matter, with the community. And to find out, is there, in some ways, when I'm talking about integrity, I'm not even talking about moral integrity. I'm also talking about structural integrity. You know, is there integrity in who is telling this story? And I think that a couple of things. One is, and it's rare that I ever get these calls, because I think a lot of us in the Native creative community, in the Native filmmaking community, are getting we're getting a very high volume of folks approaching, whether it's Bird, Renningwater, Sterling Harjo, so many different filmmakers getting approached by non-Native people with their projects. And they're trying to find a Native person to bring into the scenario. And I know this happens in all different spaces. I'm just speaking to this specifically. And that's multiple times a week that I'm finding myself in these conversations. What's very rare, almost never, do I hear from somebody saying, I would love to support an Indigenous filmmaker. Do you know any Indigenous filmmakers with a story to tell that I could get behind them and put my, whether it be their access, their resources, their privilege, whatever it may be. I just don't find myself in those conversations. That's shocking to me. But in terms of the question of what could a collaborator do with, to support a community, is find that community's storytellers, and find the way to support those storytellers. And if somebody is more emerging, even better, go and support that person. I mean, I often say that I feel like the thing about the canon, the great canons of talent, whether it's the literary canon or the cinematic canon, the canon is all about who has had the opportunity. It isn't about who's most talented. It's about who has had the opportunity. And so I feel that if a collaborator or an ally is looking for a place of support, well, the support really is needed for these emerging storytellers or established storytellers who just haven't had the support or the opportunity. That would be my answer.
Thank you. I think, canon, that might be something, Shanaina, for you to speak to, because I think the idea of canons is itself contested, like whether we still need those sort of attempts to essentialize or to say that a list of 10 is more important than the rest of it. So could you speak to that dynamic?
I mean, I had a discussion earlier this week about canon. We should fight the canon, what we should do with the canon. I think we should just leave the canon being the canon and do our thing, because the list of this Eurocentric perspective of doing things, that to have the film, the 10 more important, this word of, or you have one thing or the other. This is not the way we should be process knowledge, because our knowledge comes from different bases. We can do we can have possibilities, like I'm thinking about the South epistemologies, indigenous epistemologies, Africans, epistemologies in a sense, in a broader sense. I'm not talking about academic knowledge. I'm talking about the way of perception, life, and everything. So, and of course, I totally agree with Heather about, it's about the canon is about who has, the power, In fact, because we're in this capitalistic world, you can't forget that. So to do things and to write about it and to create the audience, in the terms of these repercussions. So, just we have so much to do. We have, amazing history to help to reach a broader audience, So I'm just not more concerned in, you know, fighting or, you know, dealing. Okay, sometimes I do read and I do use them, but, you know, I didn't like, you know, propagate it as the most important thing to do. And I think also in that sense also we see others, authors and filmmakers and referencing, you know, just as you started quoting Paulin Vieira, you know, I was wondering who, you know, in fact, has read, you know, his work. He's so fundamental to African film history, not only as a filmmaker, but as the first historian, in fact, you know, film critic. And, you know, until now, few people has really watched Afrique Succinct, for example, you know, the very first African film, so to speak. So I think that's our, you know, our fight, you know, to talk about those references and not, you know, just leave the canon be in the canon. Just
absolutely, which is to say that some structures can't be reformed, and the energy is better spent in generating alternatives that come from our histories, as opposed to trying to force a structure that was never meant for us anyway to accept us. And I appreciate you bringing back Vieira, because it connects to a question that someone had brought up, which is that if we also need different ways to read oppositional cinemas, and I think as you're pointing to, we do, and they exist. There have been African scholars of cinema like Vieira. There's indigenous scholars of cinema. We also don't need to apply the Eurocentric, you know, theoretical, political basis to examine our own work. And this goes to a different angle on that kind of question, which is about, would you say that there is a tyranny of accepted formats when it comes to broadcasters, platforms, and distribution avenues, and how do we overcome those limitations?
I'm not sure what's meant by tyranny of accepted formats. But I do think, you know, that whatever that is, it's expanding. I think that, you know, we're seeing documentaries in new ways. People are liking documentaries in new ways. There's, you know, that format is being expanded. You know, we can talk about the limitations of, you know, the world being ruled by, you know, Netflix and Amazon and Hulu and those people, you know, who are all money-making enterprises finally. So, you know, that's what they're trying to do. But I do think that, you know, within that, you know, if you can get it on there, you know, then, you know, they're accepting other formats. I think the problem is there's a tyranny of those who have the power to accept the formats. You know, that I think if I'm understood there, you know, that you know, the gatekeepers are all from the same tribe, pretty much, and so they all, you know, have the same tastes, pretty much. And so a lot of times, you know, they might not understand the films in the same way that we do.
There was a question that came earlier, which is what films deal with the impact of settler colonialism and imperialism on Black sexualities and provide perspectives beyond the gay straight binary?
I hope that question isn't for me, because I'm not sure what that film is, but maybe somebody else knows that if those films exist. I don't know.
It cut it a little bit. I didn't, you know, get the question.
The question was, can you talk about any films you know of that deal with the impact of settler colonialism and imperialism on Black sexualities and provide perspectives beyond the gay straight binary?
I don't know if there is. I mean, you know, we have been trying to get off the ground, and maybe we will now, a film about Hollywood and you know, the way Hollywood looks at Black sexuality and has for the last, over 100 years, and what effect that's had, not only on how black people are perceived, but even in some ways, more importantly, on how black people see themselves and their own sexuality. And so it's something that we've been trying to launch for, I don't know, 15 years or so. And I think we're getting close to being able to do that.
And I think that this question is making an important point, that we also can't ever overgeneralize something like oppositional cinema or liberation cinema, because a form of cultural production that is addressing one dominant system might also be reinforcing another one at the same time. And I think going back to Heather, the point you were making about how it's crucial to always have that position of interrogation and of questioning and of not assuming that sort of everything is being said in one go. Another question would be, if any of you could speak to, if you have a sense of the idea of what a documentary is changing, with different technologies, with different forms of access. Because one thing I'm thinking about, for example, to name one specific filmmaker, which is Sara Gomez, who was a Black woman, Cuban filmmaker. And one of her most well-known films is one that mixes fiction and documentary. So it lives in that sort of unsettled place where it has documentary footage, and a lot of those sort of agitational, militant forms of cinema, maybe like The Hour of the Furnaces, were ones that mixed documentary footage with other forms, and sort of weren't really easily classifiable. So do you think that that there is this continuing work of opening up what a documentary is?
Thinking about some like Black experience, even I quote Zózimo Abolição, and you mentioned Sara Gomez. I can think about Safi Faye. I think this canon that established that this connection between documentary and reality, and somehow I see, those filmmakers that were not concerned about those lines, and they were just doing their thing in a way that, and creating some reality with their gesture of the films also. So I think also it has to do this limits has pretty much to do with the canon idea about what is the documentary. And thinking about, the new generations, people that are doing films now, they are really not concerned anymore with those. They're pretty much just worried about doing their thing, just telling their stories, and if that includes some reenactment, and that includes some fictionalization, I'm thinking about very specific situations, and I think they're pretty much okay with that. So I don't know if I'm answering you, but just to add on that.
Yeah, I think what's amazing for me to see is that, how people are accepting this new way of making docs. I think that's really what's amazing to me. When I saw, Hale County, I was like, hey, I really love that film, but nobody else is gonna like it, and it was nominated for an Academy Award. When I saw I Am Not Your Negro, I said, yeah, I love that film, but I don't know what other people are going to think about it. It was nominated for an Academy Award. People loved it, so I think that what's really important is that people are expanding what they want to see, and what whether, I don't care what they call it. They could call it George if they want to. They don't have to call it a documentary, but it's something that people are seeing and understanding and liking. And that's partially because so many of the time, fiction filmmaking is kind of so dead, so many times, because, the money is spent on, Spider-Man.
Yeah, absolutely. Which is to say that if you give the people different sorts of films, they're going to watch different sorts of films and want to watch them. So we're just about out of time. And I want to thank all of you for your time, for your presence, for your expertise, to thank Hope and Mara once again for doing the work of interpreting. And if you have any final sign-offs, we'll be on our way.
Thank you. It's great.
Thank you. Thank you. And if people can, just please watch Abolition. It's online. I don't know, just Google it. Zazima Bubu and Abolition, and then you tell me what you think about it. I would love to hear. Thank you all.
Thank you.
I will add one film to the previous conversation, which I think is an interesting exploration of the collapsing of genre, and that is The Infiltrators. I think that the hybridized form is something for us to really be exploring and to feel free. And I'm a true believer that storytellers are narrative designers, and that we're creating culture when we tell stories, and that in a lot of ways, as narrative designers, storytellers, we're really creating the future. You know, we're designing the future, which is one of the reasons why it's so important, you know, for people to be exploring their voices and realizing, you know, those visions. So thank you so much for the inclusion in this conversation.
Yeah, if I have to name a film, I would say watch Loida's film Through the Night. You know, it's a film where form and content, you know, are mixed together in this incredible way. You know, yeah.
Awesome.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.